The first thing you noticed about Roy Callahan was his hands. Not his size, though. He had the kind of size that settles into a man's bones after decades of hard living and never quite leaves. Not his eyes, though. Those would get your attention soon enough. It was the hands first. Big, scarred across the knuckles in the way that only comes from real work, the kind that leaves a mark permanent enough that no amount of quiet years can fully erase it. Those hands moved through the morning routine at Callahan's Diner with the certainty of a man who had done the same thing 10,000 times and expected to do it 10,000 more. 5 o'clock every morning, not 5:01, not 4:59. 5 o'clock the same way the sun came up over the ridge east of Grover's Bend, Kentucky, not because anyone told it to, but because that was simply the order of things. The coffee went on first, then the grill, which Roy lit with a long wooden match he kept in a ceramic jar, shaped like a rooster that had been sitting on that same shelf for going on 11 years. The jar had belonged to the woman who sold him the building. She left it behind when she moved to Pensacola to be near her daughter, and Roy had never once considered moving it. Some things earn their place just by outlasting everything around them. By 5:15, the place smelled like it was supposed to smell: coffee, strong enough to strip paint, bacon grease warming on the flat top, and something underneath both of those things, something older and harder to name, the smell of a room that had absorbed 19 years of the same morning, repeated until the walls themselves had memorized it. Grover's Bend was not a large town. It sat in a shallow valley in eastern Kentucky between two ridges that had never been important enough to have proper names accessible by one state highway that wound down from the north and one county road that came in from the west and didn't go much of anywhere after it left. The kind of town that appeared on maps but not in conversations. The kind of town where the same families had been sitting at the same tables for 3 generations. And the coffee cup you reached for at the diner was probably the same cup your father had reached for before you. Roy had not grown up here. He had arrived 19 years ago with a truck, a steel box he kept locked, and no explanation anyone ever thought to ask for. He'd bought the building on Callahan Street, which he had not named after himself. The street had been named Callahan long before he arrived. A coincidence he'd never bothered to clarify, and opened the diner inside of a month. He'd painted the sign himself. He'd built the counter from reclaimed oak he'd found in the barn behind the property. He'd done most of the work with his own hands quietly without asking for help, and the town had watched him do it the way small towns watch newcomers, with a patience that was also a form of judgment. He passed the judgment eventually. It took about 2 years. By the time the third year rolled around, Roy Callahan had become the kind of fixture a town doesn't know it needed until it's already there. The truckers came through before sunrise because the coffee was ready and the eggs were exactly what they were supposed to be every single time without variation. The older men came at 7 because the counter had enough stools to fit all of them, and Roy never hurried anybody. The lunch crowd came because the food was honest. Nothing on the menu that required a paragraph of description. Nothing that couldn't be identified by looking at it. A plate of food at Callahan's looked like food. That mattered more to the people of Grover's Bend than anyone who had never lived in a place like Grover's Bend would understand. Roy talked when people wanted to talk. He was quiet when people wanted quiet. He had an instinct for the difference that some people are born with and cannot be taught, and over 19 years of 5 o'clock mornings, he had refined it into something close to an art form. He was 67 years old. Gray-haired, close-trimmed beard, the kind of broad through the shoulders that doesn't come from a gym, but from decades of physical work absorbed and compounded until it becomes the shape of a man rather than the result of effort. He moved through the diner with economy, no wasted steps, no wasted motion, the efficiency of someone who has learned that a body has a finite number of movements in it and has decided to spend them carefully. People in Grover's Bend liked Roy Callahan. More than liked him, trusted him in the wordless way that trust operates in small towns, not declared, but demonstrated through the slow accumulation of mornings in which he had been exactly who he appeared to be and nothing else. Wren Pruitt had walked through the door 8 months before the morning this story is really about. She was 24 years old, though she carried herself like someone who had already lived a second life inside the first one. A kind of gravity that comes not from age, but from having absorbed more weight than a person that young should have had to absorb. She was sharp, the kind of sharp that doesn't advertise itself. She watched people before she spoke to them. And when she spoke, it was with the economy of someone who had learned that words cost something and liked to know she was getting fair value before she spent them. She had come in on a Tuesday morning asking about the help wanted sign Roy had put in the window 3 weeks earlier and half forgotten about. He had looked at her for a long moment in the way he looked at everything, not sizing her up exactly, more like just seeing her clearly. And then he had taken the sign out of the window, handed her an apron, and shown her where the coffee filters were kept. He had not asked where she came from. He had not asked what she was running from, because people who move to small towns in eastern Kentucky and ask about help wanted signs in diner windows at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday are generally running from something. And Roy Callahan had learned a long time ago that asking people about the thing they are running from before they are ready to tell you is not kindness dressed up as curiosity. It is just the other kind of thing. He gave her a key to the back door within the first month. In 8 months, he had not once raised his voice at her. Wren, for her part, had settled into Callahan's the way water settles into the shape of whatever holds it, without drama, without announcement, simply becoming the shape of the place over time. She learned the regulars faster than Roy expected. She remembered how old Herschel Beaumont took his coffee without being told twice, remembered that the pair of brothers who came in every Thursday were allergic to onions and never said so because they considered it embarrassing. Remembered that the woman who sat alone by the window on Friday mornings was not there for the food and did not want to be talked to, but did want her cup kept full and filled it without being asked. She was good at the job in the way that mattered, which was not really about the job at all. There was a photograph on the wall behind the register. It had been there since Roy opened the diner, hung on a nail he had driven himself, and it had yellowed at the edges over 19 years of morning light and cooking smoke without Roy ever once considering taking it down. The photograph showed a younger Roy, 20 years younger at least, maybe more broad in the shoulders, the gray not yet in his hair, standing in front of a long row of motorcycles. Beside him and around him were men, a dozen of them, maybe more. They had the look of men who occupied space differently than other men, not larger necessarily, but more present, as though they had more gravity than the air around them could comfortably account for. None of the men in that photograph had names as far as anyone in Grover's Bend knew. Roy had never offered them, and no one had ever pressed. Wren had asked once, just once early on during a slow afternoon when the lunch crowd had thinned out and the diner had gone to that quiet that only comes in the middle of a weekday, that lull that feels like the whole world has stepped outside for a moment. She had nodded at the photograph and asked who they were. Roy had looked at it for a moment. Not the way you look at a photograph that carries pain, the way you look at something that carries both things at once, and you have learned to hold both without needing to separate them. Then he had said those were men he used to know. Brothers, he said, in the way that word means something different once you have bled next to somebody. He said he missed who he was around them, not what they did, who he was. Wren had looked at the photograph again and not asked anything else, and Roy had gone back to wiping down the counter, and that had been the end of it. She had not fully understood what he meant. Not then. 6 months before the morning, this story becomes a different kind of story. The quiet that Grover's Bend had maintained for as long as anyone could remember began to develop cracks. It started small, the way things that are going to become large almost always do. A new group had moved into the commercial strip on the east end of town, not a business, not exactly more of a presence. They called themselves Iron Hollow. Young men mostly with a meanness that comes not from cruelty exactly, but from having discovered a shortcut to feeling powerful and deciding that the shortcut was the destination. Their operation was straightforward. They walked into small businesses and explained politely that the neighborhood had become dangerous. They explained that for a modest weekly contribution, they could ensure that the danger did not extend to whatever establishment they happened to be standing in at that moment. The conversation was always polite. It was always brief. And the alternative to the modest weekly contribution was never spoken aloud because it did not need to be. Hargrove's Hardware paid first. The owner, a man named Delbert Hargrove, whose father had built the store from a single room in 1962, stood behind his counter for a full minute after the men left before he took the envelope out of his register drawer and set it on the counter where they'd told him to leave it. He did not sleep well that night, and he did not sleep much better for the weeks that followed. The laundromat on the corner went next. Then the tire shop on the south end held out for nearly a month before a brick came through their plate glass window on a Wednesday night, and they stopped holding out. Within 2 seasons, every business on that stretch of road was leaving an envelope on a counter every Friday afternoon, and the men who came to collect it were always polite, and the alternative was never spoken aloud, and somehow that made it worse. The man behind all of it was named Trace Mercer, 27 years old, tattoos running up both sides of his neck in patterns that had once meant something to someone, and now mostly meant that Trace Mercer wanted you to know he was the kind of man who had tattoos running up both sides of his neck. He had a smile that worked perfectly well as a mechanical function. The corners of his mouth went up. His teeth showed, but the smile never made it as far as his eyes, which stayed flat and measuring regardless of what the rest of his face was doing. People who had known Trace longer than he would have liked said that he had grown up watching his father get pushed around. Landlords, foremen, men who held small amounts of power over other men and used it the way small men use whatever power they have thoroughly and without mercy. Trace's father had absorbed it, had bent and stayed bent, had taught Trace without meaning to that the world was divided into the men who pushed and the men who got pushed, and that the only question worth asking was which one you intended to be. Trace had decided early. He had built fear instead of respect because fear was faster, and because in his experience the two were close enough to the same thing that most people couldn't tell them apart until it was too late to matter. 3 days before the morning, this story becomes what it becomes. Trace Mercer walked through the front door of Callahan's Diner for the first time. He came in with two of his crewmen who had the careful blankness of people paid to be present rather than to think, and they settled onto the stools at the counter with the ease of people claiming territory. Trace spun his stool once, slowly looking around the diner with the expression of a man taking inventory of something he has already decided belongs to him. He looked at the old photographs on the wall. He looked at the regulars who had gone quiet at the sight of him and his crew without quite knowing why they'd gone quiet. He looked at the photograph behind the register, the younger Roy, the row of motorcycles, the men with no names. Then he looked at Roy. Roy looked back. Trace told him the neighborhood had gotten dangerous, said there were elements moving through the area that a man running a business like this, a nice little place, a real community institution. He said that word institution with the smoothness of someone who has used it before, would want protection from. Said for $200 a week he would personally ensure that nothing unfortunate happened to such a fine establishment. Roy poured 3 cups of coffee, slid them across the counter without a word. Did not charge for them. Then he said one word. No. The word did not shake. It did not rise at the end like a question. It did not come with an explanation or an apology or any of the decorations that people who are afraid usually attach to it to soften the blow. It arrived in the space between them, clean and flat, and final the way a door sounds when someone closes it from the other side and you hear the latch catch. The whole diner went still. Trace's smile flickered. It was a small thing, barely a movement at all, but it was there. The smile had been designed to work in all conditions, and it had worked in all conditions right up until this moment. And the small flicker was the smile encountering something it hadn't been designed for and not quite knowing what to do about it. He looked at Roy for a long moment. Roy looked back, the same way he'd been looking before. No more, no less. Trace laughed. It was a good laugh, professionally produced, carrying none of the flicker that had passed through the smile. He said he'd swing back by in a few days. Give Roy some time to think it over. Think about what made sense for a business in a neighborhood like this. He said it was an open offer. He and his crew walked out. The whole diner let out a breath it had been holding. Wren came over once they'd gone. She kept her voice low, but Roy could hear the tightness in it, someone working hard to sound calmer than they were. She told him that maybe they should just pay, that $200 a week wasn't worth somebody getting hurt over, that it wasn't worth whatever was going to happen if they didn't. Roy wiped down the counter in the long, even strokes he always used. He told her not to worry, said men like that talked a lot bigger than they hit. He believed that when he said it, mostly. What he did not tell her, what he did not tell anyone, was that he had made his decision the moment Trace Mercer walked back out that door. He had recognized something in Trace Mercer that had nothing to do with Iron Hollow, or protection money, or the business of fear. He had recognized the architecture of a man who had confused power with respect and built his entire life on that confusion. And Roy Callahan knew with the clarity of someone who had once stood on that same architecture and watched it crack under his own weight exactly where that road went. He just hoped it wouldn't come to what he already knew it was going to come to. It came to it 3 days later. The door came in loud. That was the point of it. The three men who came through it were not there to negotiate or escalate or give anyone a second chance at the second chance Trace had already offered. They were there to demonstrate something the way you demonstrate a principle concretely, unmistakably, in a language that requires no translation. The first one put his boot through a chair on his way in. Not because the chair was in his way, because the sound of it was the sound of something breaking, and breaking things was the message. The second one walked the length of the counter and swept it clean ketchup bottles. Napkin holders, the small ceramic creamer shaped like a cow that Wren had brought in herself and set near the register because she thought it was funny. All of it onto the floor. The sound of glass on tile. Pure noise, pure damage, the kind that isn't about the things being broken, but about making everyone in the room understand who is in charge of the next few minutes. The third one was the one who grabbed Wren. He didn't ask her to move. He didn't speak to her at all. He took her arm the way you take hold of something you intend to relocate and threw her not carefully, not with any particular aim, and she hit the edge of the counter hard enough that her knees buckled and she went down. And the sound she made when she hit was the kind of sound that once you have heard it, you do not forget which moment it belongs to. Roy set the spatula down. He came around the end of the counter the way he did everything slow, unhurried, without a single wasted motion. The first man, the thick-necked one who had come in leading, saw him coming and laughed. An old man in an apron. Coming toward three of them like that was a thing a person should do. Like it was a reasonable decision. Roy stopped, stood there 1/2 second longer than he needed to. He said, "Walk out now and we forget this happened." The man swung instead. Roy let the punch come to him, watched it travel. At the last possible fraction of a second, he moved his head 3 inches to the left, and the fist went past his ear into nothing. And before the man had finished understanding that he had missed, Roy's hand was already closing around the back of his neck. One motion. The man's face met the edge of a table and he did not get back up. 9 seconds, give or take. The second man grabbed a chair because somebody had to do something, because the moment required a response, and a chair was what was nearest. Roy stepped inside the arc of it before it reached full extension. The chair came down across his back instead of his skull. He drove a fist up under the man's ribs, felt the breath leave the body all at once, the way it does when something stops the lungs from working, and the chair clattered off fingers that had forgotten how to hold anything. The third one swung from panic. Roy leaned away from it, got a hand in the collar, walked him forward and through what remained of the front window. The glass that hadn't already come down came down then all at once, in the way that glass falls when there is no longer anything holding it together. Silence. Not the silence that means nothing is happening. The silence that means everyone in the room is recalibrating what they thought was possible. Someone laughed, the nervous kind, the kind that escapes a body the moment it believes it might be safe to breathe again. Roy helped Wren to her feet first, checked the cut on her forearm where she'd caught the counter edge. Then he looked down at the three men, one on the floor, one bent over the counter, trying to locate his breath, one on the sidewalk outside, working out where he was, and told them quietly to go back to Trace Mercer and let him know that Callahan's wasn't paying. Not this week, not any week, not ever. They went. Roy swept the glass himself, told the regulars breakfast was on the house, sat Wren down at the counter, and poured her a coffee she hadn't asked for. The room filled back up with low conversation, everyone already in the process of turning 9 seconds into a story they'd be telling for years. Roy finally poured himself a cup and sat down on his stool at the end of the counter. He rolled one shoulder, the left one, which carried an old ache that cold mornings made worse, and let out a breath that had clearly been waiting its turn. He looked to anyone watching exactly like what he was supposed to be, a tired man who had handled a little trouble and was ready to put it behind him. Wren asked him low and careful where a man learns to move like that. Roy smiled, just barely, said it was a long time ago, said it didn't matter anymore. He believed every word of that when he said it. The phone behind the counter rang. Roy let it go twice. Then he picked it up. He listened. He said nothing. And whatever easy, settled look had been resting on his face, the look of a tired man who had handled a little trouble packed itself up quietly and left, and what it left behind was something older and considerably less easy. The voice on the other end said his name first, his full name, Roy Callahan. Then it paused the way people pause when they want you to understand that the name means something to them, that they have done the work of knowing it. Then it said, "We know who you are now. All of us are coming." Then it hung up. What had happened in the 20 minutes since those three men limped out of Callahan's was this: they had made it back to Trace Mercer, and Trace had been furious in the way that men who are not accustomed to failure become furious when they encounter it loud hot, looking for somewhere to put the heat of it. But in the middle of that fury, one of the older men on the Iron Hollow crew had been listening to the description of the diner and of the old man, and of the way those three had gone down, and something in that description had reached back into a part of his memory he kept stored somewhere dark and rarely visited. This man had spent time years back at the edge of a world that Roy Callahan had once occupied near the center. He had never been part of it himself. He had been close enough to see it, close enough to understand what a name like Callahan meant in that world, close enough to know that men who carried that name in that world did not do so lightly and were not reduced to running roadside diners without a reason, and the reason was never weakness. He had gone pale when the description matched the name in his memory. He had told Trace quietly that this was not a shakedown gone wrong, that what they had walked into was not an old man they had underestimated. He told Trace that a name like that, alive and breathing, witnessed dropping three of their crew without a second thought. If word of that got out, and it would get out, because word always got out, that was the nature of word, then Iron Hollow was finished. Not weakened, not embarrassed, finished. It stopped being about $200 a week. It became something else, something colder and considerably more final. Roy stood behind his counter with the dead phone still in his hand and understood with the clarity that comes not from thinking, but from something older than thinking, exactly what kind of time he had left and exactly how little of it there was. He did not panic. What happened instead was quieter and in its own way more unsettling to watch, though there was no one left in the diner to watch it. 40 years seemed to fall away from him in the space of about 3 seconds. Not the age stayed, the gray stayed, the ache in the left shoulder stayed. What fell away was the effort, the conscious daily 19 years running effort of being the man in the apron instead of the man in the photograph on the wall. The man underneath was still there. He had always been still there. Roy called out to the remaining regulars in a voice that left no room for questions or conversation. He told them to go out the back right now and not come back today. They looked at his face and went without a word, the way people go when a voice sounds like that. Then there was Wren. He told her to take his truck, drive to her cousin's place 2 towns over. He said it the same way he said most things, without excess, without decoration. But there was something underneath the words that she heard clearly, the same way you hear a change in the weather before you can name exactly what has changed. She did not move. She stood in the wreckage of her morning, the broken glass still on the floor, the ceramic cow that had been her small contribution to this place, lying in 2 pieces near the register, and she told him she was not leaving him alone with whatever was coming. Roy looked at her for a moment. Then he walked into the back office. He came out holding the steel box, set it on the counter between them, opened it. Inside, on a fold of old cloth, was a patch. Leather dark with age, the edges frayed in the way that leather frays after decades of being carried from one place to another without ever quite finding a permanent home. The kind of patch that is not bought or given. The kind that is earned in ways that are not written down in any document that a court of law would recognize as legitimate, in moments that the men who were present for them remember with a specificity that time does not touch. Wren looked at it. She had grown up in eastern Kentucky and she knew exactly what she was looking at. She understood in the way that people who have grown up near things understand them without being told what a patch like that represented, what world it came from, what it cost. She looked up at Roy, and in that moment she understood all of it. The 19 years of 5 o'clock mornings, the photograph on the wall with no names attached, the way people leaned in when he spoke, the way he had looked at Trace Mercer across that counter without a single thing in his face that resembled fear. She understood why he had never asked where she was running from. He had spent a long portion of his own life running from something too, and he had finally found a place worth stopping. Roy told her gently that he needed her gone, not because he was afraid for himself, because he did not want her in the room watching him become that man again. He said he had spent 40 years walking away from that man, and he did not want the last picture of him she carried in her memory to be the one that was coming. Wren took the keys. She walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame, did not turn around. Then she walked out. Roy locked the back door, righted what chairs could be righted, reached under the counter to the place he had checked every single morning for 19 years and never once needed and confirmed that what was there was still there. Then he stood behind his counter, hands flat on the worn oak surface in the exact spot he had stood 3 days earlier when Trace Mercer had first walked through his door. 67 years old. The most dangerous thing within 500 miles of Grover's Bend, Kentucky. Waiting. From the road outside, the sound began. Engines low at first, the way thunder sounds when it is still on the other side of the ridge. Then louder, then closer, then very close. A great many of them, arriving all at once with no plan to leave anyone behind who might later be in a position to talk about it. Roy Callahan stood behind his counter and listened to them come, and his face held the expression of a man who has already had the conversation he needed to have with himself and arrived on the other side of it at something that looked almost like peace. The engines cut out one by one, the silence between each one somehow louder than the sound that preceded it, until the last one died, and what was left was a quiet that had weight to it, a presence, the kind of quiet that precedes things rather than follows them. Roy did not move from behind the counter. He heard the doors, the footsteps on gravel, then on the sidewalk, then the sound of boots on broken glass. The glass from the window his last visitor had exited through, involuntarily still scattered across the threshold, where the morning light caught it, and threw small, fractured pieces of brightness across the diner floor. He heard them stop outside, heard the low murmur of men organizing themselves before they came through a door, and he read in that murmur the thing it was telling him. These were not the same three who had come before. Those three had come in loud because loud had always been enough. These men came in quiet because quiet meant they knew. Across the road at the Grover's Bend Phillips station, Wren Pruitt sat in Roy's truck under the gas station awning with both hands on the steering wheel and the engine off. She had made it as far as the entrance ramp to the county road before something in her chest had simply refused. Not fear, not exactly. Something older than fear had stopped her, a pull she could not have named if she'd tried. She had turned around without deciding to turn around, driven back, pulled under the awning and cut the engine, and now she sat watching the row of vehicles lined up in front of Callahan's and counting and arriving at a number that made the air leave her lungs. She did not start the engine. She told herself she was just going to watch. That was the only honest thing she had to offer herself in that moment, so she offered it and held on to it and watched through the gas station glass as the door to Callahan's opened. They came in slowly. That was the first thing that was different, and it was the thing that told Roy everything he needed to know about the next few minutes before a single word was spoken. The first three had come in loud and fast, because loud and fast had been their whole approach, the only approach they had ever needed. These 11 came in measured and careful, spreading along the walls, the moment they cleared the door frame, filling the room from the edges inward, the way water fills a vessel methodically, without waste, leaving no gaps. These were men who had been told what they were walking into. Roy counted them the way he had always counted them, without appearing to count the tally running in some part of him that had never stopped running it, even through 19 years of 5 o'clock mornings and eggs on the flat top. 11. 7 with something in their hands. A bat, a length of chain, a piece of pipe, others carrying the blunt weight of numbers. One man near the back wall with nothing visible in his hands, which was the one Roy marked first and kept in his peripheral vision with the attention you give to the thing you cannot fully see. Trace Mercer came in last. He stepped over the broken glass without looking down at it, the way a man steps over something beneath his notice. He looked different than he had 3 days ago. The smooth operational smile was gone. What had replaced it was tighter and quieter, and in its own way more honest, the expression of a man who has stopped pretending the situation is other than what it is. He stood just inside the doorway and looked at Roy across the length of the diner. Roy looked back, the same way he always looked, the same way he had looked at Trace 3 days ago, the same way he had looked at the 3 men who had come in, after the same way he had been looking at the world across the oak surface of his counter for 19 years. Level, unhurried, with the quality of attention that belongs to a man who has nothing left to prove and therefore nothing to perform. Trace tried talking first. He said he hadn't known. He said if he had known who he was dealing with, he would have come differently. He said maybe, and here the smooth operational quality crept back into his voice, professionally reflexively, because it was what his voice did when it was working. Maybe there was still a way to work something out, some kind of arrangement that made sense for both of them, some way to arrive at a number that reflected the particular situation they found themselves in. Even as the words left his mouth, his crew kept moving. Subtle, incremental, the kind of motion that looks like settling rather than advancing. 2 men drifted left. One worked his way along the counter to Roy's right. The man with nothing visible in his hands moved toward the corner where the counter met the far wall. Roy watched the spread. He had been listening to the words the way you listen to music being played in another room, aware of it, not attending to it because the words were not the message. The spread was the message. The words were noise designed to cover the spread, the same way the first crew's loudness had been, noise designed to cover their purpose. And Roy had learned to read the noise for what it was, covering a long time before Trace Mercer's father was old enough to make the mistakes that would eventually produce a son who needed to be feared. Roy didn't answer the words. He answered the spread. The man working his way toward the right flank had the chain, and the chain had reach, and reach in a tight space was the most dangerous variable, and Roy had identified him as the primary problem before the man had finished deciding he was moving. Roy came over the top of his own counter with a speed that none of the 11 men along those walls had believed possible in a body that old. And he crossed the distance between himself and the man with the chain in the time it took everyone in the room to begin to register what was happening, and then he was already on him. One strike. Short, direct, with no wasted motion. The throat which ends questions efficiently and without requiring a second attempt. The man folded to the floor. The room detonated. The first fight had been 9 seconds. Clean, almost surgical, one man, then the next, the whole thing over before the coffee pot stopped hissing on the burner. This was not that. This was 11 men in a space barely large enough to contain them, and there was nothing clean about it and nothing surgical, and it did not last 9 seconds. What it lasted was considerably longer and considerably worse. Roy put his back to the counter, immediately removing the angle of approach from behind him, reducing the 11 to whatever number could reach him from the front at any given moment. In the narrow space between the counter and the row of tables, that number was never more than 2 or 3, and 2 or 3 was a problem he had solved so many times in so many places that his body addressed it the way your body addresses the act of walking automatically below the level of conscious decision. A bat came down across his left shoulder. He had seen it coming, had made the calculation that getting out of the way entirely would have opened a gap behind him he couldn't afford, had accepted the hit in exchange for the position. The arm went half numb from the shoulder down. He noted this the way a man notes the weather, relevant, not decisive, and kept moving. He broke a man's forearm using the chain he had taken off the first man. He drove another man face first into the pastry case, and the glass gave way, and the man gave way with it. He caught a wrist with a knife in it, applied pressure in the direction the wrist was not designed to travel, and listened to the knife hit the tile. He kept the left side of his body slightly forward to protect the ribs, which were telling him things he did not want to hear, which were going to be right about those things before long. He did not stop. This was the thing about Roy Callahan in a room like this one, the thing that men who had been in rooms like this with him 40 years ago had tried to explain to people who hadn't, and found that language was not quite adequate to the task. It was not his size, though he was still considerable. It was not his speed, though he was faster than a man his age should have been. It was not his technique, though the technique was real and it was old, and it had been built on a foundation of hard experience in places that did not appear on any tourist map. It was the fact that he did not stop. Other men in the middle of what was happening in Callahan's diner on that morning would have stopped. Not from cowardice, from something more fundamental than cowardice. From the simple biological reality that a body under sufficient damage sends signals that are designed to be impossible to ignore, signals calibrated by evolution to prevent a person from absorbing more damage than a body can absorb, signals that say enough. Lie down. Wait. Roy Callahan had learned in circumstances he had spent 19 years not thinking about how to hear those signals and set them aside. Not override them exactly. Set them aside the way you set aside a conversation you intend to return to when the current emergency has passed. He moved through the diner and through the men in it, and the number standing went down, and the number on the floor went up, and his left arm was mostly decorative at this point, and something in his left side was making its position known with increasing insistence. And he moved anyway, and the number kept going down. And then the pipe came from the corner he hadn't been able to fully watch. The man with nothing visible in his hands had been waiting, had been patient in a way the others hadn't, had read the room, had understood that the moment to move was not the moment everyone else moved, but the moment after, when attention had committed itself elsewhere. He had positioned himself in the corner where the counter met the far wall, and he had waited until Roy's back was to him by necessity, and then he had moved and the pipe caught Roy flush across the back of the skull. Not a glancing blow, not the kind that stings and clears, the kind that rings the bell of the world and tilts the floor. Roy's knees buckled. It was one moment, one long, terrible sideways moment in which the diner tilted and the light in the room did something wrong, and his hands found the edge of the counter by instinct, because instinct was all that was operating in that second, the higher functions having temporarily vacated the premises. Across the road, Wren's hand went flat against her own mouth. She had been watching through the gas station window, tracking the shadows moving through the diner's front glass, reading the shape of what was happening without being able to see it clearly. And then she had seen Roy go down, and it was not ambiguous, and she stopped breathing entirely for that 1 second with her palm pressed against her lips. Inside the diner, every man still standing read the same thing in the same moment and arrived at the same conclusion. It was over. The old man was finally actually down, and it was over. Trace took a step forward from the doorway. Roy found the edge of the counter with his palm. The motion that followed was not graceful. It was not the kind of thing that would look like anything other than what it was, which was a man refusing to stay down through an act of will, so concentrated and so stubborn that it overrode the very clear and very insistent message his body was sending him about the appropriate response to the current situation. He pressed his palm against the oak surface he had built himself from reclaimed wood 19 years ago, and he pushed, and his knees straightened and he was upright. For a moment he just stood there, both hands on the counter, head down, breathing. Then he raised his head. The man who had swung the pipe was already moving forward, already confident in the completion of a job, and Roy met him with a single elbow that traveled about 8 inches and ended the question with a finality that left no room for follow-up. The man dropped. Roy straightened fully, took his hands off the counter. 6 men still standing, all of them having revised in the last 15 seconds every assumption they had made about how this was going to go. Trace reached for the thing at his waistband. The gun came out, and every sound in Callahan's diner stopped at once. Not gradually, all at once. The way sound stops when something happens that reorganizes the fundamental nature of the situation, that moves everything that came before it into a different category. The category of before. The before was the fight, the 11 men, the bat and the chain and the pipe, the controlled chaos of bodies in a tight space. The before had rules, even brutal ones had a logic that a man like Roy could work within and work through. The after was a man 27 years old with a gun in his hand and 6 men at his back, pointing it across 12 feet of diner floor at a 67-year-old man who was bleeding from his hairline and favoring his left side, and had by any reasonable external measure already absorbed more than any reasonable body should have had to absorb. Roy stood against his counter and looked at the gun, and then looked past the gun at the hand holding it. The hand was shaking. A genuine visible shake that ran from the wrist up through the elbow in a way that Trace Mercer could not have stopped if he had tried, and he was trying. Roy had seen this before, had been in rooms like this one in the before version of his life, where the gun came out and the room stopped, and he had looked at the hands holding those guns and read in those hands everything he needed to know about what the next 5 seconds would bring. He had learned over years and in conditions he did not like to return to, even in memory, that the most dangerous gun in a room was not the one held by the angriest man or the largest man or the man with the most to lose. The most dangerous gun in a room was the one held by the man who had never pulled a trigger on a living person, but was in a position where not pulling it had become the more difficult option. Trace Mercer had built an entire organization on the principle that fear was sufficient, that the suggestion of violence maintained consistently and credibly produced the same result as violence itself at a fraction of the cost. He had been right about that. He had been right about it for 6 months in Grover's Bend, and for years before that in other places, with other small businesses and other frightened owners who had done the math and decided that the envelope on the counter every Friday was cheaper than the alternative. He had never had to cross the line. The line had always been close enough to the edge of the conversation to do its work without being crossed. Now he was standing in a room where the line was the only remaining option, holding a gun with a shaking hand. And Roy Callahan was looking at him with the eyes of a man who had crossed that line so many times that it no longer registered as a line. Roy spoke. His voice was the same voice he had used 3 days ago when he said the single word that had started all of this. Not loud, not hard, not angry. Quiet the way the hour before dawn is quiet. Not the absence of something, but a presence in itself. He told Trace that if he meant to pull that trigger, he had better not miss. He said it plainly, without inflection, the way a man states a fact about the weather or the price of something. He said that if the bullet failed to finish things, if it failed for any reason in any degree, then he was going to walk across the 12 feet between them and take that gun out of his hand. And after that, there would be no more talking. Not for Trace, not for the 6 men standing at his back. He said this without raising his voice or changing his expression. He said it the way a man says something he has already decided is true and therefore doesn't require the performance of certainty to make credible. Trace's hand shook harder. The 6 men behind him were doing math. Roy could see it happening in the way men go still when they are running calculations they would prefer not to be running. They had come in here with numbers and weapons and the weight of a working organization behind them, and what they were standing in now was the wreckage of all of that 8 of their crew down an old man bleeding in front of them who should by any logic be on the floor and wasn't, and a boss holding a gun with a hand that could not find a way to be steady. The math was not resolving in anyone's favor. Roy looked at Trace and Trace looked at Roy, and the 12 feet between them had the quality of a held breath, the whole room balanced on a point so fine it could not maintain itself much longer in either direction. The battered old clock on the wall behind the register, which Roy had been meaning to replace for going on 3 years, continued to do the only thing it knew how to do. Tick, tick, tick. The diner held its breath, and Roy Callahan stood in the middle of it, hands loose at his sides, watching a young man discover in real time the distance between who he had believed himself to be and who he actually was, and waited for whatever was going to come through the door next. He did not have to wait long. The door opened. Every head in the room turned. The six men standing shifted. Trace's eyes cut sideways, the gun moving fractionally off its line. And in that fraction, Roy read everything. The relief of a reason to pause, the hope that whatever was coming through the door was something that changed the shape of the moment, made a decision for him, delivered him from the choice he was holding at the end of a shaking arm. Ren Pruitt walked in. She came through the door without running, without shouting, without any of the theatrics that the moment seemed to demand from the outside. She walked the way Roy walked, without waste, without performance, as though she had considered what she was doing and decided it was the thing to do, and that was sufficient reason. She was not carrying anything. No weapon. Nothing that could change the physical arithmetic of the room. Just herself, 24 years old, in the blue diner apron with the coffee stain on the left pocket that she'd been meaning to treat for a month. And in her right hand, raised up to where every person in the room could see, it held out like something being offered or something being named rather than threatened. She was holding the patch. The old leather dark with years' edges frayed in a way that meant something specific to anyone who knew what they were looking at. She held it up and she let the room see it. Let the silence that followed do the work that words were going to need help doing. Then she spoke. Her voice was steady. Not loud would have been wrong, would have made it into a confrontation, when what it needed to be was a statement of fact. She said that every man in that room knew what that patch meant. She said the man whose name belonged to it was standing right there behind that counter bleeding because they had not been smart enough to understand what they had walked into. She said that the people who gave out patches like that one did not forget their own, had never forgotten their own, and that not one man in this room could say with certainty that those people were not still out there and still paying attention. She said what she said, and she held the patch up, and she let the room decide what to do with it. Roy watched it land. He watched it land in the face of the man near the back wall. The older one, the one who had once spent time at the edge of a world Roy had once been near the center of. Watch the color change in that face. Not fear exactly. Recognition, which is sometimes more powerful than fear, because fear can be pushed through and recognition cannot. Recognition just is. It sits in the chest and it knows things, and it will not be moved by willpower or adrenaline or the company of 10 other men who are also discovering they may have miscalculated. That man lowered his weapon. He did it without drama, without announcement, the way you lower something when you have decided the weight of it has exceeded the value of carrying it. He set the bat against the counter and took one step back. The man beside him looked at him, looked at the patch, looked at Roy, and then he set his pipe down on the nearest table as though it had become too heavy to hold. Then the next man. Roy stood behind his counter and watched it move through the room, the way a current moves through water, invisible, inevitable. Each man arriving at the same calculation through his own path and arriving at the same answer. The hiss of the coffee pot, still going on the burner behind him, was the only sound in the diner for a long moment. 6 men had entered with weapons. 5 of them had now set those weapons down. 1 man remained. The same man who had been at the center of this from the beginning, standing near the entrance to a diner in Grover's Bend, Kentucky, with a gun in a hand that would not stop shaking, having arrived at the precise moment his entire construction of himself was being asked to answer for what it was actually made of. Trace Mercer held the gun and looked at Roy, and Roy looked back the same way he had been looking for 3 days, the same way he had been looking across the worn oak surface of his counter for 19 years, at everything the world had sent through his door, without performance, without fear, with the simple settled attention of a man who has been to the end of the road. This road leads to and knows exactly what is there, and is therefore neither hurried nor uncertain about anything that is happening in this room. The gun was still up, the hand was still shaking, but something behind Trace's eyes had shifted, and Roy had seen that shift before too, in other rooms, in other times. and he knew what it meant. It meant the question had already been answered. It meant the next thing that happened was going to confirm it, not determine it. Roy took his hands off the counter and stepped forward. He walked the same way he had walked toward 3 men who had come in loud on a Tuesday morning. The same way he had walked toward 11 men who had come in quiet and knowing and armed with more than chairs and bad intentions. Unhurried, without waste. Each step deliberate in the way that only comes from a man who has already made his peace with what is on the other side of the next few seconds and therefore has no reason to rush toward it or away from it. 12 feet. Trace watched him come, and the gun stayed up, and the hand kept shaking, and the distance between them shrank, and the room stayed absolutely silent around the shrinking of it. 10 feet. Roy's left arm still hung wrong at the shoulder. His left side moved with the careful economy of a man protecting something broken or close to broken underneath. The blood from the gash above his hairline had tracked down the left side of his face and dried to a rust color along his jaw, and none of it had changed his pace or his expression or the direction of his eyes, which were on Trace Mercer with the same quality of attention they had held for the entirety of this morning and the 3 days that preceded it. 8 feet. Trace's arm was fully extended. The barrel of the gun was level. Everything in the situation was arranged the way it should have been arranged for a conclusion of the kind Trace had intended when he walked through that door, and none of it was resolving into that conclusion. And the reason it wasn't resolving was the man walking toward him who had not received the message that the gun was supposed to deliver. 6 feet. Roy stopped. He stood there 6 feet from the barrel of the gun and looked at Trace Mercer the way you look at something you have seen before and understand completely, and he said the last thing he intended to say in this room before this was over. He said that Trace had built everything he had on the fear of other people, that he had found a shortcut early on and mistaken the shortcut for the destination and built a whole life on that mistake. He said he understood why. Said he had known men who made the same calculation and had even for a time understood the logic of it. Then he said the last part, the part that was not philosophy, but simple observation. The part that landed in the room with the weight of something that cannot be unsaid once it has been said. He said today you found out what it feels like to stand on the other side of it. He said it without satisfaction, without cruelty, with the flat, clean delivery of a man stating something that is true and requires no embellishment to be true. Trace Mercer stood with the gun in his shaking hand and looked at Roy Callahan from 6 feet away, and something happened in his face. Not a collapse, not a dramatic unraveling, something quieter and more permanent. The expression of a man watching the structure he has lived inside of his entire life develop a crack that goes all the way through and understanding in the same moment that the crack has always been there, and that the building was never as solid as the looking at it from the inside suggested. The gun came down, slowly the way something descends when the mind has already decided and the arm is simply catching up. It came down to his side and his fingers opened, and the gun hung there for a moment from a hand that had released its grip, and then Roy stepped forward one more step and took it. Trace led him. That was the thing. That was the fact of the matter, stripped of everything around it. A 67-year-old man bleeding from the head with a bad shoulder and ribs that were filing formal complaints stepped forward and took a gun out of the hand of a 27-year-old man who had walked into that diner with 11 people and full intentions, and the 27-year-old let him. Let him. Not because he couldn't have stopped it. Not because his fingers had failed. Because something in him had arrived finally and irreversibly at the understanding that the gun had already lost whatever argument it had been brought into the room to win, and there was no version of what came next that was improved by holding on to it. Roy held the gun at his side, looked at Trace for a moment. Trace looked back. The operational smile was gone, and the tighter, more honest expression that had replaced it was gone too. What was there now was just a face. A 27-year-old face that looked in this particular moment considerably younger than 27. Roy set the gun on the counter behind him without taking his eyes off Trace. The 5 men who had already put their weapons down had not moved. They stood where they were along the walls and among the tables, and they had the look of men waiting for permission to understand that something was finished. Roy gave it to them. He told them in the same quiet voice he had used for everything today that they were going to leave. He told them they were going to do it now, and they were going to do it without picking anything back up on the way out. He looked at each of them as he said it briefly, the way you make eye contact to confirm that a message has been received rather than merely transmitted. They went. No one said anything. No one looked at Trace for instruction or confirmation. They filed out through the broken front window frame and across the glass-scattered threshold and out into the morning, and the sound of them going was the sound of men who have decided that distance is the most valuable thing available to them at this particular moment and are pursuing it with full commitment. Trace stood where he was. Roy looked at him. He told Trace to sit down. Trace sat on the nearest stool the way a man sits when his legs have finally collected on a debt the rest of him had been ignoring. He sat and he put both hands flat on the counter in front of him and he looked at them. Roy went around behind the counter. He moved with the careful deliberateness of a man whose body has begun to tabulate the morning's costs and is presenting the bill in real time. He reached under the counter and found the first aid kit he kept there and set it on the counter. Then he reached for 2 cups and the coffee pot. He poured both cups, set one in front of Trace. Trace looked at it, then looked at Roy. Roy said nothing. He opened the first aid kit and began with his right hand. The left was still only partially reporting for duty, the process of addressing what he could reach. Outside, the sound of sirens began. Distant at first, then orienting themselves toward Grover's Bend with the purposefulness of something that had been called and had answered. The regulars Roy had sent out the back had not been idle. Half of them had pulled out their phones before they'd cleared the parking lot, and by the time the door of Callahan's had opened for the last time this morning, the relevant authorities had been in possession of a description of events for going on 20 minutes. Trace heard the sirens and did not move. He picked up the cup of coffee with both hands and held it the way a man holds something when his hands need an occupation and his mind needs a moment. He said without looking up that he hadn't known about who Roy was. Roy pressed a folded piece of gauze against the cut above his hairline and held it there and said nothing. Trace said that if he had known, he would have left it alone, would have found another place, another street. He said it without the smooth operational delivery, without the practiced evenness of the professional voice he used when he was working. He said it the way people say things when the performance infrastructure has come down and there is nothing left but the actual person underneath it. Roy said that's the wrong lesson. Trace looked up. Roy looked at him steadily from across the counter. Said the problem was not that Trace had picked the wrong target. Said the problem was the thing he had been doing to every other business on that street for 6 months, to frighten people who did not have whatever it was Roy happened to have, who did not have 40 years of a particular kind of experience that meant a morning like this one landed differently for them than it landed for Delbert Hargrove at the hardware store or the woman who ran the laundromat. Said the measure of a thing was not whether it eventually ran into someone who could stop it. Said the measure of it was what it was. Trace looked at the coffee cup in his hands. The sirens were close now, a minute away. Less. Roy came around the counter again and stood near the register in the space where Wren had stood holding the patch up with the steadiness of someone who had decided what they were doing and was doing it. He picked up the patch from where she had set it when she'd lowered her arm, and he looked at it. He turned it over in his hands. The leather was smooth in the center where it had been handled over decades, and rough at the edges where time had worked on it without mercy. He had not held it in years, had not needed to, had not wanted to. It weighed almost nothing. Things that cost the most often do. He stood there with it a moment longer than he needed to, not looking at it exactly, more feeling the weight that wasn't there, the weight the thing carried in spite of its lightness, the weight of a life lived at full intensity and then deliberately set down the weight of every morning for 19 years, in which he had chosen the counter and the coffee and the apron over the other thing. He had thought for a long time that putting the patch in the box and the box in the drawer was the same as being done with it, that the distance was the same as the change. Standing here now, bleeding with the morning's evidence distributed across the floor of the place he had built with his own hands, he understood that the man who had earned that patch and the man who had just put 11 armed men on the floor of his diner were not two different men who had lived sequentially. They were the same man who had made a choice every single day for 19 years and had kept making it and would keep making it past this morning until the mornings ran out. He folded the patch carefully along a crease it already knew and set it on the counter. Then he went to the door. Wren was already crossing the road. She came through the broken frame already in motion, eyes moving across the room, reading what needed doing, and going toward it without stopping to take stock of what it had cost. She looked at Roy first the way you look at someone when you need to confirm they are still present, in the full sense of the word, that they are not just upright but actually there. Roy met her eyes and something passed between them in that exchange that did not require language and did not get any. She looked at Trace on his stool with his coffee cup. She looked at the damage the morning had distributed throughout the diner, the broken glass and the overturned furniture, and the dark stains on the tile that were going to require more than a mop and some time. She looked at the 8 men on the floor in various states of consciousness, and the weapons they had brought in that were now distributed across the floor and the tables and the counter. Then she went to work. This was Wren Pruitt. This was what she did when the thing that needed doing shifted from one thing to something else. She moved. She pulled her phone and made the call to confirm the ambulances were coming because some of the men on the floor were going to need them regardless of the choices they had made to be there. She cleared a path through the debris near the door so that when those ambulances arrived, the paramedics could move without additional hazard. She found Roy's first aid kit where he'd left it on the counter, and she moved him to a stool, and she finished the work he had started on the cut above his hairline with both hands and considerably more thoroughness than he had managed one-handed. Roy sat on the stool and let her. He looked around his diner while she worked. The photograph on the wall still there, unbroken, the younger Roy, and the row of motorcycles and the men without names still present in their yellowing rectangle of paper, having witnessed whatever they had witnessed this morning without comment. The ceramic rooster on the shelf beside the grill still holding its wooden matches. The clock that he had been meaning to replace for 3 years still performing the only function it had ever had. Callahan's Diner, Grover's Bend, Kentucky. 19 years and one morning. The police arrived before the ambulances, which was the order of things. 2 patrol cars first, then a third, and then the kind of escalating response that happens when the initial officers arrive at a scene and radio back a description that causes the people receiving the description to send more. The officers who came through the door had their hands on things and their eyes moving and their voices at the professionally elevated register of people managing a situation they are still in the process of understanding. They found one old man on a stool getting a cut dressed by a young woman in a coffee-stained apron. They found 8 men in various conditions on the floor. They found one 27-year-old sitting at the counter with both hands visible and a coffee cup, and the look of someone who has arrived at the decision to cooperate not because he has been told to, but because the available alternatives have been thoroughly evaluated and found wanting. Trace Mercer was arrested at the scene. He did not resist. He stood up when he was asked to stand up, and he put his hands where he was asked to put them, and he looked once at Roy before they walked him out, a look that Roy received and held for a moment, and then let go of the way you let go of something you have been carrying and do not intend to pick back up. 6 of his crew who were capable of being processed were arrested with him. The other 2 were transported with the men who needed the ambulances. Trace's crew, all of them, because Roy Callahan, at 67 with a bad shoulder and cracked ribs and a head wound, had not for all of that been trying to kill anyone. He had been trying to end things, which was different, and the difference was the kind of difference that 19 years of 5 o'clock mornings had made in a man. The investigation that followed was not complicated in the way that investigations involving organized crime sometimes become complicated, where the evidence is distributed carefully across distances designed to make the connections difficult to draw. Trace Mercer had not been running that kind of operation. He had been running the kind of operation that works until it doesn't, built on the assumption that the people it was working on would remain too frightened to say anything definitive to anyone in a position to act on it. That assumption had dissolved. Delbert Hargrove from the hardware store came in the day after and gave a statement that covered 6 months of Friday envelopes in detail that suggested he had been keeping count since the first one which he had. The woman from the laundromat came in the day after that. The owner of the tire shop drove down personally and gave his statement and then drove back and took down the phone number Trace's people had left him and threw it in the trash with a thoroughness that suggested the act carried emotional significance beyond the practical. Business by business, envelope by envelope. Friday by Friday, the record assembled itself. Security footage from 3 different cameras on the strip provided images. Witness accounts from the regulars Roy had sent out the back of Callahan's that morning provided testimony about what 11 men with weapons had come to do to one old man who had told them no. Iron Hollow was finished within a month. The structure of it had been Trace Mercer, and Trace Mercer was in custody, and the men around him who might have carried it forward had looked into the wreckage of a Tuesday morning in a small diner in Grover's Bend and decided that the career path had revealed certain structural limitations they were not prepared to work within. The hardware store stopped its Friday envelope in the first week. The laundromat followed. The tire shop owner's act of throwing away the phone number turned out to be complete and accurate, and no one came to dispute it. Grover's Bend went back to being quiet. Roy reopened Callahan's 3 days after that morning. He did it the same way he had opened it every morning for 19 years alone, at 5 o'clock with the coffee going first and the grill lit with a long wooden match from the ceramic rooster that had never moved from its shelf. The new glass in the front window was not quite the same shade as the old glass, slightly clearer, which meant the morning light came through it at a marginally different angle and hit the floor in a slightly different pattern. And Roy noticed this on the first morning and filed it under things that would become normal in time, because that was where things like that belonged. The regulars came back. They brought friends, as people do after the kind of morning that generates the kind of story that spreads through a small town, the way water finds its level completely without gaps, reaching every low place it can find. For a while, Callahan's was busier than it had been in all 19 years combined, which Roy accepted with the graceful patience of a man who knows the fuss will wear itself down eventually and has no interest in either encouraging or discouraging it. He poured their coffee and he waved off their thanks, and he let the morning do what mornings do, which is to keep arriving regardless of what the previous ones contain. Wren came back the same day Roy did. She had not waited to be asked. She showed up at 4:45, which was 15 minutes before Roy arrived, and when he came through the back door, she was already running the coffee. She had put the ceramic cow, which had survived the morning with only one ear broken off, which she considered acceptable losses, back in its place near the register. She had put the photograph back on the wall, which had come down during the second fight and somehow not broken. She had put the patch back in the steel box herself with both hands and put the box back in the drawer in the back office where Roy kept it. Neither of them talked about that morning much afterward. There was a conversation they had once in the slow hour between the lunch crowd and the dinner regulars, when the diner had settled into its midday quiet and the light through the new glass was doing what it did. Wren was refilling the napkin holders, and Roy was at the end of the counter with his coffee, and she said without building up to it that she had been thinking about the photograph. Roy looked at it. She said she thought she understood now what he had meant that first time she'd asked. About missing who he was around those men. Not what they did, who he was. Roy held his coffee cup. She said she thought maybe who he was around them and who he was behind this counter were not as different as he had wanted them to be. That what she had seen that morning was the same man. That the man who had moved through 11 people without stopping was the same man who had handed her an apron and a key and never once asked where she'd come from. That the thing underneath both of those things was the same thing, and that maybe the only difference between the two versions of him was not what he was, but what he chose to do with it on any given morning. Roy looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then he said that she might be right about that. Said he had spent a good portion of 19 years trying to make them different, trying to make the man in the apron and the man in the photograph into two separate people, because it was easier to live with them as two separate people. Easier to set one down and pick up the other. Easier to believe that what he had walked away from had stayed where he left it. He said, turns out, you carry more of it than you think. He said it without regret, just as an observation. The kind of thing a man says when he has finished being surprised by a truth and has arrived at the stage of simply acknowledging it and moving on. Wren nodded and went back to the napkin holders, and Roy went back to his coffee, and the afternoon came in through the new glass at its slightly different angle. And the diner held them both in its quiet, which was not quite the same quiet it had been before that morning, but was quieter quiet, the kind that has been tested and held. A year after that morning, Wren found an envelope in the stack of mail she picked up from the box at the end of the access road on a Wednesday afternoon. No return address, but the postmark was from the correctional facility in Lexington, where Trace Mercer was serving concurrent sentences on 6 counts of extortion, 2 counts of assault, and additional charges that the investigation had surfaced in the weeks after his arrest. The envelope was addressed to Wren Pruitt at Callahan's Diner, not to Roy. She stood at the end of the access road in the afternoon light and opened it and read it twice before she went back inside. It was handwritten, 3 pages. Trace's handwriting was careful, the handwriting of someone who had learned it late and still thought about the individual letters rather than just making them as though each one required a separate decision. He did not open with an apology. He opened with a statement. He said he had been trying to write the letter for 8 months and had thrown away more versions than he could count, and that the reason he kept throwing them away was that they kept coming out sounding like the kind of apology that was also an explanation, and he had decided that an explanation was not what the letter should contain. He said he had grown up watching his father made small, said he had decided before he was old enough to have a full picture of what that decision would require, that no one would ever make him small. Said he had pursued that goal with everything he had for his entire adult life and had believed genuinely and without reservation that what he had built was the proof that he had succeeded. He said that on the morning in Callahan's Diner, he had understood for the first time what he had actually built. He said he had stood in that room with a gun in his hand, facing a man who was bleeding and outnumbered, and in obvious physical difficulty, a man who by any external measure should have been finished, and the gun had meant nothing. He said he had never understood before that moment what it looked like when a man was genuinely not afraid of you, not performing bravery, not refusing to show fear as an act of defiance, simply not afraid. In the way that water is not afraid of the shape of the vessel it fills, not because it is resisting the shape, but because the question of being afraid of it does not apply. He said he had looked at Roy Callahan and understood that Roy had been somewhere the gun could not reach, had been there for a long time, and that no version of what Trace Mercer had brought into that diner was going to change that geography. He said that was the first time in his life he had seen what it looked like to be that far on the other side of the thing he had spent his whole life running toward. He said he was sorry, not for getting caught, not for the consequences, for the thing itself, for Delbert Hargrove and the laundromat and the tire shop and every small, frightened person who had left an envelope on a counter every Friday and gone home and not slept well. He said he was sorry in the plain, undecorated way that sorry is only available to a person who has stopped trying to make what they did smaller than it was. And then he said one more thing. He said he didn't know what Roy Callahan had done in the life that preceded the diner and that he didn't need to know. He said that whatever it was, the man he had encountered on that Tuesday morning in Grover's Bend was a man who had chosen something deliberately and lived inside that choice with a totality that Trace had never seen before and did not know existed before he walked through that door. He said Roy could have done whatever he wanted to the people in that room, and what he had done was pour coffee and go back to his counter, and that Trace did not have the language yet to say fully what that meant to him, but that he was working on finding it. He said he hoped Wren was well. He did not ask for a response. Wren folded the letter along its original creases. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking out at the diner, at Roy, at the end of the counter with his afternoon coffee, and the photograph on the wall, and the ceramic rooster on its shelf, and the clock he had never replaced. She thought about showing it to him. She thought about it carefully, the way she thought about things that mattered, and then she thought about what Roy would do with it, and she thought about what he already knew, which was most of it, and she thought about the conversation they had already had in the slow afternoon hour, and what had been said in it, and what had been sufficient. She went to the register. She opened the drawer below it. She put the letter in the back of the drawer behind the spare receipt rolls and the rubber bands and the small accumulation of miscellaneous items that the back of a register drawer gathers over time, the quiet debris of daily operation. She did not show it to Roy. She did not throw it away. Roy Callahan ran Callahan's Diner for 11 more years. 11 years of 5 o'clock mornings, the coffee first, the grill lit with a wooden match from the ceramic rooster, the smell of a place that has absorbed the same morning, repeated until the walls have memorized it. 11 years of the truckers before sunrise, and old Herschel Beaumont at 7, and the lunch crowd and the afternoon quiet, and the dinner regulars, the accumulation of ordinary days. That is the true substance of an ordinary life, which is the only kind of life Roy Callahan had wanted for a very long time and had in the end managed to keep. The left shoulder never fully came back from that morning. He wore it differently afterward, a slight adjustment in how he carried himself that was visible if you knew to look for it, and invisible if you didn't. The ribs healed the way ribs heal slowly with commentary that lingered longer than expected on cold mornings. The cut above his hairline left a scar that his hair covered most of the year, and that was visible in the summer months when he cut it shorter. A thin, pale line that Wren noticed when she cut his hair, as she had started doing about 2 years after that morning when he mentioned the barbershop had closed, and she had picked up the scissors with the confidence of someone who had decided a thing was within their capabilities and did not require further deliberation. He never raised his voice at another living soul in those 11 years. He flipped eggs and poured coffee and listened to the regulars talk about their days and their families and their small accumulated concerns, and he gave each of those conversations the same quality of attention that he gave everything, which was complete and unhurried, and people left Callahan's feeling, without being able to say exactly why, that they had been genuinely heard by someone who was genuinely interested, and that this was rarer than it should have been and worth coming back for. He watched Wren grow into herself over those years, watched her shed the last of whatever she had been carrying when she'd walked through his door 8 months before. That Tuesday morning, watched her become the kind of person who walked into rooms the way she had walked into that diner, with the patch without waste, without performance, already moving toward what needed doing. He did not say any of this to her. It was not the kind of thing Roy Callahan said. But she knew he saw it, the way you know when someone sees you clearly and approves of what they see, and that knowledge was its own kind of thing. The years passed the way years pass in a place where the mornings are regular and the work is honest, not slowly, not fast, but with the even accumulation of something that is building without drawing attention to the building. Roy passed away on a November morning in the small apartment above the diner where he had lived since he moved to Grover's Bend 19 years before that morning and 11 years after it. The coffee he had set on the burner before coming upstairs was still warm when Wren arrived at 4:45 and found that Roy's truck was in the lot, but Roy had not come down. She climbed the stairs and found him in the same condition the rest of his life had been conducted in, quiet without excess, not requiring anything of anyone. He went the way he had wanted to go, in his sleep without announcement, without the prolonged and demanding business of a difficult ending. He had always moved through the world with economy, and he moved out of it the same way. Half of Grover's Bend came to the funeral. The other businesses on the strip sent flowers. Hargrove's Hardware sent the largest arrangement, a thing of considerable size, that Delbert Hargrove had clearly put thought and time and more money than was strictly necessary into, and it occupied most of the left side of the room at the service, and smelled strongly of carnations which Roy would not have chosen, but which Delbert had, and that was the point. The tire shop owner came himself and sat in the third row and did not say much to anyone, but stayed until the very end and was one of the last to leave. Wren handled the arrangements. She did it the way she handled everything efficiently without unnecessary fuss-making decisions when decisions needed to be made and not making them when they didn't. She picked the hymns because someone had to, and Roy had not left instructions, which she thought was entirely characteristic of him, the assumption that things would sort themselves out, that the people remaining were competent to manage whatever needed managing. She was right about that. She managed it. She kept the diner. She had been keeping it in practical terms for the last few years anyway. Roy had been present every morning, had been at his stool, had still poured his own coffee, and talked to the regulars, and been what he had always been in that room. But Wren had been running the operational side of Callahan's for a while, and when it became hers formally, it became hers without disruption. The way water assumes the full shape of a vessel when the last constraint is removed. She hired a second person to help with mornings, a young man from 2 counties over who needed the work and learned fast and reminded her in certain lights, in certain moments of no one she could name exactly, but something she recognized. She kept the menu exactly as it was. She kept the hours 5 o'clock the same time every day, because some things earn their place by outlasting everything around them, and you do not change them out of respect for what they have outlasted. She kept the photograph on the wall still yellowing at the edges now, more than before still showing a younger Roy among men whose names had never been provided and were no longer needed by anyone. The photograph had been there long enough now that it had become part of the diner, the way the counter was part of the diner, the way the ceramic rooster was part of the diner, not decoration but structure, a load-bearing element of what the place was. She kept the ceramic rooster on its shelf beside the grill. She bought wooden matches in bulk and kept the jar full. She kept Roy's stool at the end of the counter empty, not with ceremony, not with a sign or a velvet rope or any of the formal apparatus of memorial. She simply did not seat anyone there, and after a short period the regulars understood, and the newer customers picked it up from the regulars without being told. And the stool was simply not a stool that people sat on. And that was that. And no one who understood what the stool represented thought this was excessive or sentimental, because it was neither. It was accurate. The steel box was still in the drawer in the back office. She had not opened it since the morning she had put the patch back in it with both hands, the morning after that Tuesday, when she had come in before Roy and made the coffee and put things back where they belonged. She did not need to open it. The thing that the patch represented and the man it had belonged to were not in the box. They were in the photograph on the wall and in the worn spot on the oak counter where Roy's hands had rested for 19 years, and in the smell of the morning in a room that had been having the same morning for going on 30 years. Now the layers of it so deep in the wood and the walls that no renovation could have removed them and no one who came through the door would have wanted to. They were in the empty stool at the end of the counter. They were in the drawer in the register behind the spare receipt rolls, where a 3-page letter in careful handwriting had been sitting undisturbed since a Wednesday afternoon, a year after a Tuesday morning that half the town still talked about, and the other half had decided they preferred to let alone. Not from discomfort, but from a kind of instinctive respect for the privacy of a man who had never once sought attention and had only received it when other people's bad decisions made it unavoidable. Grover's Bend was quiet. It stayed quiet. The businesses on the strip stayed open, and their owners slept well on Friday nights, and the envelopes stayed in the register drawers where they belonged, and the tire shop owner had not had a brick through his window in 11 years and did not expect to have one. The kind of quiet that a town earns by going through something and coming out the other side of it with its fundamental nature not just intact, but confirmed. Every morning at 5 o'clock, the lights came on at Callahan's Diner, and the coffee went on, and the grill came up to temperature, and the smell of the place, the coffee and the bacon grease, and the something underneath both of those that was older and harder to name. The smell of accumulated mornings of the same good thing, done the same right way, 10,000 times came out through the vents and into the morning air of the street. The new glass in the front window had long since stopped being new. It had acquired its own layer of cooking smoke and morning light, its own slight yellowing at the corners, its own history. The light came through it now, at the angle it came through it, and that angle was the angle it was, and the pattern it made on the floor in the early morning was the pattern it made, and Wren had stopped noticing it as different from the old pattern years ago, because it wasn't different anymore. It was just the pattern. The photograph still hung on its nail behind the register. The men in it still had no names that anyone in Grover's Bend had ever known or now needed to know. They didn't need to know. The man who could have told them had told them the only part that mattered in a slow afternoon hour between the lunch crowd and the dinner regulars, in the particular quiet of a weekday when the whole world seems to have stepped outside for a moment, and the things that are true have room to be said without competing with anything else. Those were men he used to know. Brothers in the way that word means something different once you have bled next to somebody. He missed who he was around them, not what they did, who he was.